government moving with amendments to the Income Tax Act 1961. This bill has now been introduced in the Lok Sabha. The idea behind these amendments is to withdraw the changes that were made about retrospective tax demands. Now, if you remember, in 2012, this became an extremely big controversy and an extremely contentious issue when the then government and the then finance minister, now late Pranab Mukherjee, came up with a clause of retrospective tax. The government at that point of time had done it to circumvent a Supreme Court order so that they could tax companies like Vodafone and Cain and several other international companies on the business that was being conducted in India. Now, the NDA government today has made changes to the law to bury this retrospective tax clause, to remove it from the income tax completely in a bid to send a message to the world that we are going to give you a friendly taxation atmosphere. But that's not the only reason. Why is it happening in 2021 when the retrospective tax came in 2012, when the NDA government came to power in 2014? It is also happening now because the government has lost two big tax battles and arbitrations, one with Vodafone and with Cain. With Cain, in fact, it's gotten to such an ugly point where the company has begun to move to start seizing Indian government's assets abroad to take its money back. So rather than getting into that kind of an ugly arbitration fight, the government is saying we'll change the law. And by changing this law, these companies won't have to pay us this tax. In fact, if they have paid us already some part of that tax, we will give it back to them, provided they agree to our conditions. Samir Kanabar, tax partner at EY India, is joining me. But before I go across to Mr. Kanabar, let me bring in Avni Raja. Avni, one of the biggest stories from 2012 and a battle that has gone on since then, another of those legacies that the NDA government got from UPA, but finally being put to rest today. What can you tell us about what the government has done today?
Well, that's right, Tanvi. Like you pointed out, this has been such a long battle, especially with regard to these two companies. And secondly, the messaging that you pointed out, that was also extremely important for it, because any sort of global investor who's looking to invest in India with this kind of a taxation policy, it's obviously going to deter them. And right now, we do need foreign investors to come in, given the situation we are in with respect to the pandemic. So that is, of course, one big reason. And the second, like you pointed out, when we talk about Vodafone as well as Cain, two big companies and two big cases were lost by the government of India in international courts. So all of that put together seems to be the reason why the government has taken this decision. Now, just to put some of the numbers into perspective, Cain was supposed to owe about $1.2 billion, that's 9,000 odd crore, and Vodafone about $3 billion, that's 23,000 odd crore. And so far, the government has collected, in terms of retrospective taxation, 8,100 crore. Of that, Cain alone has contributed to 7,900 crore, and the balance from some of the other companies. So what this will essentially do now, it will help put to rest these this entire litigation process for these companies, and also it will give that boost for investors to come in and sort of, be assured that this is going to be a safe place to invest in terms of the funding, the investments at this point in time. So the government now also, not just has it, taken away the retrospective taxation, it proposes to repay the companies which it has, taken money from in the form of retrospective tax. And Cain is going to be one of the biggest beneficiaries of this as well. So two parts. One is the refund of this money without interest, though, but also subject to certain processes being followed and certain assurances from the companies. And second, of course, is with respect to the litigation aspect completely going away as well. Tanvi.
Well, let's bring in Mr. Kanabar on this as well. Mr. Kanabar, so there are two options now for these two big companies, and that's where everybody's interest lies. But they've already won their arbitration battles. They don't really, at least Cain doesn't have to really pay this money. Vodafone doesn't seem to have money, and its current owner in India is saying, I will shut down if you don't save me. What does it mean for these two companies and the money that they owed the government? I don't think Mr. Kanabar is through with us. I think there is a technical glitch there. His line has actually frozen. Just to point out, like Avni was saying, even though Vodafone has a bigger amount that it should have paid or was raised as a tax demand by the government, they haven't actually paid much of that. Only 44 odd crores has been paid by Vodafone. So they won't get much of refund, but they won't have to pay the pending money if they actually go as per the new amendment. So the government actually looking at two different things here. One is in terms of messaging. The government's official argument is, well, we need to restart the economy after the pandemic hit us. We would want more investors to come in, global investors to come in. We've done so many reforms in infrastructure and construction and several other aspects of business and industry. And this is just another way of us telling the global investors that we're not going to unfairly tax you or raise up old tax demands. That retrospective tax ghost has now been buried. In 2012, what's flashing on your screens is when this was announced by late Pranab Mukherjee, who was then the finance minister, and it actually created a huge furor. The government and Vodafone had already been in a tax battle for a really long time. Vodafone had in fact won that tax battle, where the Supreme Court had said that the government cannot tax Vodafone on certain transactions, and then this change was brought in, which has now been done away with. Mr. Kanabar, help us understand, what does it mean for companies like Kane and Vodafone now?
No, so this is first of all a very welcome move, although 9 years down the line, but it is still the right time, and especially when we are looking at huge CapEx investments in India, this could not have been a better opportunity for the government to bring in this law. Obviously, the law clearly provides that whatever taxes have been paid will be refunded, obviously without interest, but clearly the taxes that have been collected will be repaid back. This would also mean that obviously the provisions that the companies would have made in their books as a liability payable to government, these provisions will now sort of move off their balance sheet, and that will strengthen their balance sheets. And that would mean that the companies will be able to attract more capital for those specific companies. And also there are 17 total companies, so another 15 companies which would also now face the same benefit out of this amendment in the law, and they would also be benefited equally.
So you're saying company like Vodafone can actually remove 23,000 crore from its liability segment, and that would make it a lot more attractive for any investor to come and help Vodafone at this point. Would that be correct?
And then this, of course, this liability sits in Vodafone UK and not in Vodafone India.
Yes.
But yes, it's a huge amount, and if we are talking about $2 or $3 billion, that would be a major lifeline if that amount can be pumped in.
Okay.
In Vodafone India.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kanabar. I'm afraid I'm completely out of time, but thank you for joining us and sharing your insights on what this really means for the biggest of the companies, and not just these two, but many others who were staring at these tax demands in various forms of legal battles with the government can now finally move on. Now, this current government did not use retrospective tax to raise any fresh tax demands by itself in the last 3-4 years. So it's not to say that the clause itself was in use, but it's the old battles that had to be resolved that has now been done. Out of time. On the other side, it's an Olympic special. Stay with me.